My name is Chloe, and my life has been turned upside down, not once, but twice. To understand how, I should start at the beginning. I was born to loving parents, Mark and Lisa Smith, in a small suburban town. My dad was a journalist, and my mom worked as a nurse. We weren't rich, but we were happy. Life was pretty normal until I turned 12, when everything changed. It was a rainy Tuesday evening, and my parents were driving home from a dinner party. I was at home with my grandma, watching a silly cartoon when the phone rang. I'll never forget the chill that ran down my spine as I heard my grandma's muffled sobs from the kitchen. The next few days were a blur. My mom had died on impact, and my dad had survived, but barely. When I finally saw him in the hospital, he was a shadow of the man I had known. His legs were crushed, and the doctor said he would never walk again. "Chloe," he croaked, reaching for my hand. "I'm so sorry, sweetie. I'm so sorry." I didn't understand why he was apologizing. It wasn't his fault. A drunk driver had crashed into their car. But as I grew older, I realized he was apologizing for what our lives had become, the struggles we would face, the mother I had lost, and the father he thought he could no longer be. Despite it all, my dad, Mark Smith, was stronger than he gave himself credit for. Once he was out of the hospital and settled into his wheelchair, he threw himself into his work. He had always been a talented writer, and now he channeled all his energy into his job as an editor at the city's major newspaper. As I entered my teens, Dad made sure I had everything I needed. He encouraged me to join clubs, make friends, and have as normal a life as possible. But the truth was, I preferred spending time with him. We'd watch old movies, argue about books, and he'd help me with my homework. When it was time for college, Dad insisted I go away to school. "You need to spread your wings, kiddo," he said. "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." I was hesitant but knew he was right. So I went to State University, majoring in accounting. There, I met Jessica, who would become my best friend. Through Jessica, I met her second cousin, Michael. Michael was kind and funny, and he didn't bat an eye when I told him about my dad. In fact, when he first met Dad, they hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared love of classic rock. "Your old man's cool," Michael told me later, "and you're pretty amazing for taking care of him all these years." Inside, I glowed with pride. For the first time since the accident, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could have a normal life. A life with love, laughter, and even a family of my own someday. After graduation, life seemed to fall into place. I landed a job at a local tax service, and Michael started working as a long-haul truck driver. We dated for 2 years before he proposed on a crisp autumn evening in the park where we had our first date. I was over the moon, but there was one thing I needed to make clear. "Yes, Michael," I said, "but I can't leave my dad. He needs me." Michael's face broke into a wide grin. "I wouldn't have it any other way. We'll all live together. Your dad's apartment is big enough for the three of us, right?" The wedding was small but beautiful. Dad insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle to give me away. There wasn't a dry eye in the house. As I stood there, hand in hand with Michael, I felt like I was living a fairy tale. But every fairy tale has its villains, and mine were my mother-in-law, Karen, and my sister-in-law, Emily. From the moment I met them, it was clear they didn't approve of me. "So, your father is handicapped?" Karen asked during our first meeting, her nose wrinkling as if she'd smelled something unpleasant. "He's disabled," I corrected, trying to keep my tone neutral. "But he works as an editor." "How nice," she interrupted, clearly uninterested. "Michael, darling, are you sure about this? There are so many nice girls from good families." I felt my face flush with anger and shame, but Michael jumped to my defense. "Mom, Chloe's from a good family. Her dad's disability doesn't change that. I love her, and that's all that matters." That silenced Karen, but the disapproval lingered in her eyes. Emily, taking cues from her mother, was equally cold. After the wedding, true to his word, Michael moved in with Dad and me. Our life settled into a comfortable routine. I worked at the tax office, Michael was on the road for days at a time, and when he was home, we'd all have dinner together. But whenever Karen and Emily visited, the atmosphere in our home changed. They'd strut around like they owned the place, barely acknowledging Dad's presence. Once, I overheard Karen muttering to Emily, "It's a shame. Michael could have done so much better. Now he's stuck with this girl and her crippled father. What if they have children? Can you imagine the genes?" I was furious but bit my tongue for Michael's sake. I tried to keep the peace, but it was getting harder and harder. One evening, after a particularly tense visit from Karen and Emily, I broke down in tears, feeling utterly overwhelmed. Michael found me in our bedroom, sobbing uncontrollably. Hey, hey, he said softly, pulling me into his arms. What's wrong? Between hiccuping breaths, I managed to say, It's your mom and sister. They hate me. They think I'm not good enough for you because of Dad. Michael's expression hardened. That's ridiculous. You and your dad are my family now. If they can't accept that, it's their problem, not ours. His words provided some comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of our troubles with Karen and Emily. As the months passed, Michael's trucking business began to flourish. He was constantly on the road, crisscrossing the country in his big rig. I missed him terribly when he was gone, but I threw myself into my work at the tax office and spent my evenings keeping Dad company. One crisp autumn evening, while I was helping Dad into bed, Michael called. His voice crackled with excitement over the phone. Flo, I've been thinking, he said. How would you feel about buying a townhouse? It would be easier for your dad to move around in a wheelchair, and he could spend more time outside. Plus, you could have a garden, something to keep you busy when I'm on the road. The more he spoke, the more I warmed to the idea. I glanced at Dad, who was pretending not to eavesdrop. What do you think, Dad? I asked, putting the phone on speaker. Dad's eyes lit up. A garden would be nice, he admitted, and it would be easier to get outside. That settled it. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into house hunting. We finally found the perfect place, a spacious townhouse with wide doorways, a roll-in shower for Dad, and a beautiful backyard. Taking out a mortgage was daunting, but with Michael's income, my salary, and the rent from Dad's old apartment, we managed to make it work. We moved in on a sunny spring Saturday, and I'll never forget the look on Dad's face as he wheeled himself out onto our new patio. This is perfect, sweetie, he said, his eyes moist with gratitude. Thank you. The next few months were idyllic. We settled in, making the place our own. I planted a small vegetable garden, and Dad would sit outside for hours, soaking up the sun and fresh air. Then came the housewarming party. We invited friends, colleagues, and yes, Karen and Emily. The party was in full swing when they arrived, fashionably late as usual. They sauntered in, eyeing everything with barely concealed envy. As we moved through the house, I could see the wheels turning in Karen's mind. When we reached the master bedroom, she turned to me with a sly smile. You know, Flo, she said, her voice low, this would be perfect for Michael and me. Why don't you send your father to a nursing home so I can move in here? I felt as though I'd been slapped. Excuse me. Oh, don't look so shocked, Karen continued. Your father isn't well. He's not a whole person anymore, is he? He doesn't need all this luxury. A nursing home would be more than enough for someone in his condition. Before I could respond, Karen marched out to the patio where Dad was chatting with some guests. To my horror, she grabbed the handles of his wheelchair and began pushing him towards the driveway. I shouted, running after Karen. What are you doing? If he won't go to a nursing home, he can stay outside. Karen smirked. That's what you wanted, isn't it? For him to be outdoors? I was shaking with rage and disbelief. Thankfully, Michael had heard the commotion and came running, his face red with anger at what his mother was doing. Mom, he bellowed. What the hell are you doing? Let go of Mark's chair right now. Karen looked taken aback by Michael's tone. But honey, I don't want to hear it. Michael cut her off sharply. You and Emily need to leave, now. After Karen and Emily left, Michael apologized profusely to Dad and me. I'm so sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I had no idea she would. I'm just so sorry. Dad reached out and patted Michael's hand. It's not your fault, son. Some people just can't understand. Life eventually settled into a new rhythm after the housewarming incident. Karen and Emily kept their distance, which suited me just fine. Michael threw himself into his work, taking on more long-haul routes to help cover our new mortgage. I split my time between my job at the tax office, tending to our home, and caring for Dad. 2 years passed in the blink of an eye. Our life fell into a comfortable routine. Michael was on the road more often than not, but when he was home, our little family was happy. Dad's health was stable, and he seemed content, spending his days in the garden or working on his editing from home. Then came the call that shattered my world. I was at work when my phone rang. An unfamiliar male voice greeted me. Mrs. Thompson, this is Officer Rodriguez from the Highway Patrol. My heart dropped into my stomach. Yes, I managed to reply. I'm sorry to inform you that your husband, Michael Thompson, has been in a serious accident. The rest of the conversation was a blur. Words like head-on collision and didn't make it floated around me, but I couldn't process them. It wasn't until I heard myself thanking the officer and hanging up that reality began to sink in. Michael was gone. The next week passed in a haze of grief and disbelief. I moved through the motions of planning the funeral like a robot, barely able to grasp what was happening. The day before the service, I steeled myself and called Karen. I wanted her to hear about her son's death from me, not from some impersonal newspaper obituary. "Hello," Karen's sharp voice answered. "Karen, it's Chloe," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about Michael. He's gone. There was an accident." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, to my shock, Karen's voice returned, dripping with venom. "This is your fault," she hissed. "You forced him to work so hard driving that truck to pay for your fancy house. You killed my son." I was stunned. "Karen, that's not—" "Save it," she interrupted coldly. "I expect you to give him the best funeral money can buy, but don't expect a penny from us. You made your bed, now lie in it." The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, tears streaming down my face. How could she be so cruel? How could she blame me for this? The day of Michael's funeral dawned gray and drizzly, perfectly mirroring my mood. The church was packed. Michael had been well liked in the community, and it seemed like half the town had come to pay their respects. After the service, as people filed past to offer their condolences, I was struck by the absence of Michael's mother and sister. They hadn't even bothered to show up for their own son and brother's funeral. Dad reached out and squeezed my hand. "They're lost, sweetie. We're family, and we'll get through this together." As we pulled into our driveway, something seemed off. The lights were on in the house, which was strange because I was sure I turned everything off before we left. "Did you leave any lights on, Dad?" I asked, frowning. He shook his head. "No, I don't think so." As we got closer, I could see movement inside the house. My heart started racing. Were we being robbed on the day of Michael's funeral? No less. I helped Dad out of the car and into his wheelchair, my mind racing. Should I call the police? But as we approached the front door, I heard familiar voices inside, and my blood ran cold as I recognized them. I pushed open the door to find Karen and Emily in our living room, surrounded by boxes and pieces of furniture. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my grief momentarily forgotten in the face of this outrageous intrusion. Karen turned to me, her face a mask of false sympathy. "Oh, Chloe dear, we're just helping you pack up. After all, you can't possibly afford to keep this place now that Michael's gone." I was speechless. Emily chimed in, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Don't worry, you can go back to your father's apartment. It's cozy." The rage inside me surged. "Get out," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house right now." Karen had the audacity to look offended. "This house belongs to us now. All of Michael's property does. We're his family, after all." "Like hell you are," I exploded. "Where were you today at his funeral?" "Oh, that's right, you couldn't be bothered to show up." Karen waved her hand dismissively. "We were busy making arrangements. Now be a good girl and start packing. We'll meet you out by tomorrow." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These women hadn't shed a tear for Michael, hadn't even attended his funeral, and now they were trying to kick us out of our home. "I'm calling the police," I said, pulling out my phone. Karen and Emily exchanged worried glances, clearly not expecting me to fight back. "Now, Chloe," Karen began, but I cut her off. "No, you have exactly 5 minutes to get out of my house before I call the cops. This is my home. Michael and I bought it together. You have no right to be here." Maybe it was the steel in my voice or the fire in my eyes, but Karen and Emily finally seemed to realize they'd gone too far. They gathered their things and left, but not before Karen turned to me with a sneer. "This isn't over, Chloe. You'll be hearing from our lawyers." The days following Michael's funeral were a blur of grief, anxiety, and paperwork. I threw myself into sorting out Michael's affairs, driven both by a need to stay busy and by a fear that Karen and Emily might try to claim what wasn't rightfully theirs. A week after the funeral, my heart raced when I received a call from a local law firm. I braced myself, expecting it to be Karen following through on her legal threats. "Mrs. Thompson," a crisp, professional voice asked. "This is James Anderson from Anderson and Partners. I'm calling regarding your late husband's will." A glimmer of hope sparked within me. "His will? I didn't even know he had one." "Yes, ma'am," Mr. Anderson continued. Mr. Thompson came to see us about 6 months ago. He asked that we contact you in the event of his passing. I scheduled an appointment for the next day, my mind racing with questions. Why hadn't Michael mentioned this? What did it mean? The following morning, I wheeled Dad into Mr. Anderson's office. The lawyer greeted us warmly, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. Mrs. Thompson, Mr. Smith, thank you for coming in, he said, gesturing for us to sit near his desk. I'm very sorry for your loss. Mr. Anderson opened a file on his desk. As I mentioned on the phone, your husband came to see us to draft his will. He was very clear about his wishes. I held my breath as Mr. Anderson began to read. I, Michael Thompson, Dean of Sound Mind, do hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions to my beloved wife, Chloe Thompson. I gasped, and Dad's grip on my hand tightened. Mr. Anderson continued, this includes our home, my truck, and all our savings. It is my wish that Chloe use these resources to care for herself and her father, Mark Smith, whom I have come to love as my own. Tears streamed down my face. Even from beyond the grave, Michael was looking out for us. There's more, Mr. Anderson said gently. Mr. Thompson also left a letter for you. He handed me an envelope. With trembling hands, I opened it and began to read. My dearest Chloe, the letter began, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I'm so sorry for leaving you and Mark. Please know that you two were the best thing that ever happened to me. I made this will because I knew how my mother and sister can be. I didn't want to worry you, but I needed to make sure you and Mark were protected if anything happened to me. You're my real family, Chloe. You and Mark, not them. Take care of each other. Live your lives to the fullest and know that I'll always be watching over you. All my love, Michael. The words were a balm to my aching heart, a final act of love from Michael, assuring us that we were never alone. I clutched the letter to my chest, tears streaming down my face. Dad, too, was crying, his weathered hand gently patting my arm in silent support. Mr. Anderson gave us a moment to collect ourselves before speaking again. Mrs. Thompson, there's one more thing, he began. Your husband's truck was insured. Given the circumstances of the accident, the insurance company will be paying out the full value of the policy. I looked up, sniffling. What does that mean? It means, Mr. Anderson said with a reassuring smile, that you'll be receiving a substantial sum, enough to pay off your mortgage and then some. As we left the lawyer's office, I felt a tremendous weight lift from my shoulders. We were going to be okay. Michael had made sure of it. When we pulled into our driveway, I noticed a familiar car parked on the street. My heart sank as I recognized Karen's sleek sedan. Oh no, I muttered. What now? Sure enough, Karen and Emily were waiting on our front porch. But this time, I wasn't afraid. With Michael's letter in my pocket and his love in my heart, I felt a newfound strength. Chloe, Karen began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We need to talk about Michael's estate. I stood tall, meeting her gaze unwaveringly. No, Karen, I said firmly, we don't. Michael left everything to me. It's all legal and official. And do you want to know why? Because we were his real family, not you. Now, please leave. You're trespassing on my property. For once, Karen was left speechless. Emily tugged at her arm, whispering urgently. With one last venomous glare, Karen and Emily got into their car and drove away. The weeks following our meeting with the lawyer were a whirlwind of activity. I immersed myself in settling Michael's affairs, finding solace in the distraction from my grief. The insurance payout arrived as promised, covering our mortgage and providing us with extra funds. One afternoon, while going through Michael's desk, I discovered a small notebook labeled Notes. I opened it to find pages filled with his messy handwriting, a journal of sorts detailing his thoughts and plans for our future. One entry read, thinking about starting a college fund for our future kids. Want to make sure they have the best start in life. My heart clenched. We had talked about having children someday but had planned to wait until we were more financially stable. Reading Michael's private hopes and dreams brought a bittersweet mixture of sadness and warmth. A fresh wave of grief washed over me as I clutched the notebook to my chest. Oh, Michael, I whispered, feeling the weight of our lost future. We had so many plans. That night, I tossed and turned, unable to escape the haunting thoughts of the journal and the future we'd never have. When I finally drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of Michael. He was smiling and extending his hand toward me. It's okay, Chloe, he said softly in my dream. Everything's going to be all right. I woke up the next morning with a sense of something changed within me. though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. As I got ready for work, a wave of nausea hit me so suddenly that I barely made it to the bathroom in time. The morning sickness persisted, and while I initially attributed it to stress and grief, a small voice in the back of my mind suggested another possibility. After a week of enduring this unsettling nausea, I found myself standing in the pharmacy aisle, staring at pregnancy tests with trembling hands. I bought one and hurried home, the 3 minutes I waited for the result feeling like an eternity. When I finally looked at the test, I saw two clear blue lines. I sank to the bathroom floor, overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions: joy, fear, grief, hope, all swirling together in a dizzying cocktail. "Chloe." Dad's voice came through the door. "Everything okay in there?" I opened the door, tears streaming down my face. Dad's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "What's wrong, sweetie?" he asked. I held up the test, my hand shaking. "I'm pregnant, Dad." I fell into his arms, sobbing. He held me close, stroking my hair as he used to when I was a little girl. "It's okay," he murmured. "It's going to be okay. You're not alone. Chloe, this baby is a gift, a piece of Michael that will live on." His words struck a chord deep within me. The baby was a part of Michael, a continuation of our love. The fear began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination. "You're right," I said, wiping my eyes. "This baby is a gift, and we're going to be okay." Dad smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's my girl. Now let's get you something to eat. You're eating for two now." As we made our way to the kitchen, a sense of hope bloomed in my chest. The road ahead would be challenging, but with my father by my side and Michael's child growing inside me, I knew we could face anything. As my belly grew, I found strength I never knew I had. Dad was my rock, always there with a kind word or a helping hand. We settled into a new routine, eagerly anticipating the arrival of the newest member of our family. One sunny afternoon, while tending to the garden that Dad and I had planted together, I heard a car pull up. My heart sank as I recognized Karen Seddon. What could they possibly want now? I made my way to the front of the house, one hand instinctively cradling my swollen belly. Karen and Emily stood on our porch, looking uncomfortable and slightly desperate. "Chloe," Karen began, her voice lacking its usual edge, "we need to talk to you." I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Emily chimed in, her eyes darting around nervously. "We've hit some hard times. We were wondering if we could stay in your father's old apartment just until we get back on our feet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything they put us through, they had the audacity to ask for more. "I'm sorry," I said firmly but calmly. "That's not possible. I don't want to communicate with you anymore." Karen's gaze fell on my pregnant belly, her face contorting with shock and disgust. "You're pregnant," she spat. "Already? You little—" I felt a surge of anger but pushed it down. I didn't want my baby to have such a grandmother and aunt. Instead, I gave a small, secretive smile that seemed to unnerve Karen even more. "My personal life is none of your concern," I said calmly. "Now, I think it's time for you to leave." Karen looked like she wanted to say more, but something in my expression must have stopped her. She turned on her heel, grabbing Emily's arm. I watched as they drove away, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. I had stood my ground, protected my family, and maintained my dignity. Michael would have been proud.